I don't recall much about that Easter morning, just a fragmented smear of images and sensations. But if you ask me about the Easter Bunny, I can tell you things that might make your skin crawl. It was the early 80s, and my family lived in a small, dilapidated house on the edge of a forest. The woods were thick and dark, even in daylight, and from our back porch you could see the old cemetery, its weathered headstones jutting out like broken teeth from the dirt. It was a place I tried not to think about too often, but its presence was always there, a silent sentinel watching over our lives. One Easter morning, I awoke to a scene that seemed more like a fever dream than reality. I remember the air was damp and the smell of wet hay filled my nose. I squinted through the haze of sleep and saw him, the Easter Bunny. Not the cartoonish, plushy figure you'd find in a department store, but something far more sinister. The costume was grotesque, yellowed fur, bulging eyes, and a smile that stretched unnaturally wide. The hay smell was so strong I could almost taste it. It was as if someone had rolled around in it, and now it clung to the walls, the floor, everything. The Easter Bunny's presence was fleeting, a shadow darting out of my vision as I rubbed the sleep from my eyes. When I woke fully, there was an extra Easter egg in the living room, one that my parents had never hidden. I didn't tell anyone. I was too afraid and too confused. Years later, when I was a high school sophomore, I finally broached the subject with my parents. I asked them if they had ever dressed up as the Easter Bunny and come into our room. Their laughter was a bit too loud, their denial a bit too emphatic. They said it was too much trouble, that they would never go through such an effort. I accepted their answer, though it didn't quite settle the gnawing unease in my gut. The true horror came later, when I shared my story with friends at lunch. Among them was Jessica, who lived just across the street. Her face turned pale when I recounted my experience. She told me something that freaked me out. Years earlier, she had looked out her window on an Easter night and seen the Easter Bunny standing in her driveway. Not just standing, but staring. Those same bulging eyes, that same eerie smile. She said the sight scared her, but she hadn't mentioned it to anyone, afraid that no one would believe her. The realization that others had witnessed something similar twisted my fear into a knot. I was no longer alone in my terror. It had a voice, a history that resonated with mine. Several years after that conversation, I moved away from the old house and the creeping forest that had watched over my childhood. I tried to leave the nightmares behind, but they have a way of following you. The memory of that Easter Bunny and the smell of wet hay lingered like a shadow in the back of my mind. Then came the summer of my 26th year, and with it, the news of an old cemetery's renovation. The cemetery by our old house was to be cleared, the grounds flattened for new construction. My parents, now living far away, were preparing to visit the area one last time to check on their old property. They asked if I wanted to join them, and I agreed, partly out of curiosity and partly because I wanted closure. As we approached the old house, I could feel the tension in my chest growing tighter. The place was overgrown, a wild tangle of weeds and vines encroaching on what was once our backyard. The cemetery, now largely neglected, was a grotesque patchwork of broken stones and displaced earth. My parents and I wandered around the property trying to make sense of the changes. Then, from the corner of my eye, I saw it. A patch of hay, matted and dark, lying in a corner of the cemetery. It seemed out of place, the smell of it faint but unmistakable, carried by the wind. I approached it, heart pounding, and noticed something else. Embedded in the hay were scraps of old yellowed fur, just like the costume of that horrid Easter Bunny. My parents were too busy reminiscing to notice my growing alarm. I picked up a fragment of the fur, its texture both familiar and repulsive. As I examined it, I noticed a small rusted key buried under the hay. It seemed absurd, but something compelled me to take it. Back home, I showed the key to my parents, but they dismissed it as a relic of some long-forgotten garden shed. I couldn't shake the feeling that it was a piece of a larger, more sinister puzzle. That night, alone in my room, I couldn't sleep. The air was heavy, thick with the scent of old memories and unanswered questions. In the dead of night, I heard it, the sound of rustling hay. It was faint but unmistakable. I bolted upright, heart racing. I thought I saw it standing at the end of my bed, a dark silhouette with large ears and a freakishly wide smile. It appears my mind was still haunted by the experience all those years ago. I have since moved far from the old house and the cemetery, but the fear has not left me. Every Easter I find myself looking over my shoulder, half expecting to see that grotesque costume lurking in the shadows. The hay stains, the key, the smell, they are all part of a puzzle that will never be solved, a horror that will always be just out of reach. For more stories, please subscribe. Stay safe out there. Until next time.